Welcome. You are about to view a recorded talk of the Mathematical Consciousness Science online seminar series. This seminar series aims to explore the role of mathematics in the scientific study of consciousness and hopes to connect researchers who have an interest in this topic. While every session of the seminar consists of a talk and discussions, the latter are not recorded and the following will only contain the talk. We hope you will enjoy it. For further information, please visit our website, seminar.math-consciousness.org.
Before I start, a little ad. So as you mentioned, I'm editor-in-chief of Philosophy and the Mind Sciences. I founded this journal together with Sasha Fink and Jennifer Wind. And we recently published the first part of a special issue on the neural correlates of consciousness, which can be found at philosophymindScience.org. So if you're interested in the topic of this talk, you will probably also find this special issue interesting, and here's a selection of some of the papers within that special issue. Okay, so what is this talk about? I will first, in the first part, talk about the neural correlates of consciousness, which according to the standard definition provided by David Chalmers in 2000, is an NCC is a minimally sufficient neural system, and I will discuss 3 challenges to this notion of an NCC: global dynamics, the question how to develop or investigate non-arbitrary neural correlates of consciousness, and how to find NCCs under unusual conditions. And a solution to the problems that are entailed by these challenges is provided, as I will suggest, by computational correlates of consciousness. So what are computational correlates of consciousness? I will characterize them as properties of theoretical models of consciousness, and I will say a bit more about what I mean by that. And I will argue that computational correlates should be regarded as necessary conditions for consciousness. So this is a difference to neural correlates, which are commonly characterized as sufficient conditions for consciousness. And there are 3 advantages regarding CCCs as necessary conditions. One is that they can provide evidence for the absence of consciousness in unusual cases. So if a necessary condition is not fulfilled in a certain case, that provides evidence for the absence of consciousness. It allows one to maintain a distinction between simulating and instantiating consciousness, and it has some potential for unification in the science of consciousness. Okay, let's start with the notion of a neural correlate of consciousness. So first we have to ask a correlate of what, because there are different types of consciousness, different neural correlates. So a common distinction is between global and local states of consciousness, where global states include alert wakefulness, dreaming, dreamless sleep, or coma, and local states, by contrast, are characterized or distinguished with respect to contents. For instance, seeing a red apple versus smelling a rose versus feeling a pain. And there can be neural correlates of global states of consciousness and correlates of contents. So this is a distinction that has to be kept in mind. And so just to illustrate general method for finding neural correlates of consciousness, you measure brain activity in one state, say alert wakefulness, and then brain activity in dreamless sleep, and you compare the measurements, and the contrast then gives you the neural correlate of that state that you investigated. This is just a basic idea of some of the methods that I used, and then ideally this would then give you on the one hand something like a map of correlates of contents or local states of consciousness, or places or neural areas that are characteristic or involved in bringing about conscious experiences of certain contents, particular contents such as places or faces or edges, and so on. And then there will also be a full neural correlate of consciousness, or an NCC of global, or NCCs of global states. And according to the authors of this paper, the full NCC is given by the union of all content-specific NCCs, but that's controversial. So there are different opinions on this. And what this here illustrates is also that you have to distinguish the NCCs from the effects of NCCs, that is from output from NCCs, and also you have to distinguish them from input, for instance, stemming from the reticular formation. And also you have to distinguish NCCs from global enabling factors such as blood flow or oxygen supply. So NCCs are really only meant to capture neural activity or neural areas that are specific and characteristic for certain global states of consciousness or for certain contents. Okay, and now this all was meant to be captured by a definition of an NCC provided by David Chalmers in 2000. So he proposed the following definition: an NCC is a minimal neural system N such that there's a mapping from states of N to states of consciousness, where a given state of N is sufficient under condition C for the corresponding state of consciousness. So first of all, a minimal neural system means that no proper part of N is an NCC, and that's important because otherwise the entire brain would count as an NCC, but that wouldn't be very informative. Then sufficiency means that if a state of this neural correlate of the neural system N occurs, then the corresponding state of consciousness occurs as well. So this is the second point. And then the third point under condition C. So you somehow have to restrict the conditions under which the correlation has to hold, because otherwise there are problems. So you cannot require that the condition holds under in any possible case, because otherwise you could say take a correlate of a content and extract that neural area that is associated with a given content and induce activity in that part, but it's unlikely that that will give rise to a conscious experience with a particular content, because what the NCC captures is just a core correlate that is under certain conditions sufficient for a particular conscious experience, and this means in normal brains and in normal states, basically. So to make this a bit more specific, Chalmers proposes that the correlation should hold in ordinary functioning brains, in ordinary environments, in normal brains with unusual inputs. Also, if you apply brain stimulation, the correlations should also hold, at least if there's only a local brain stimulation. But Chalmers excludes abnormal functioning due to lesions. Okay, so to sum this up, Chalmers says it seems right to say that core NCC location depends on brain architecture and normal functioning, and it is unclear that correlation across abnormal cases should be required, especially given all the associated problems. So this is the definition of a full NCC, or an NCC of background states of consciousness, and a similar definition can be given for an NCC for content. So we'll just skip this because it doesn't add much to the discussion here. So we'll focus on this definition for a full NCC or NCC of background states, and we'll now discuss some challenges. First is, what about NCCs that are characterized in terms of global neural dynamics instead of states of a neural subsystem? This is not captured by this definition. Second challenge, we can ask, why do states of N correlate with states of consciousness? Or in other words, how can we find non-arbitrary correlates of consciousness. And the third question, what if conditions C are not fulfilled? So we'll illustrate these three challenges with some examples. Here, just one study in which the authors try to discover key whole brain transitions and dynamics during human wakefulness and non-REM sleep. So different sleep stages, for instance, are often distinguished in terms of different types of EEG activity. And here the authors try to discover the global dynamics that are characteristic for different sleep stages and also for wakefulness. And what they found was that they identified a number of global states that are, however, not uniquely associated with a certain background state or with a particular global state. So here these circles stand for the different global states, and the colors denote the different background states or different global states, so wakefulness and then different sleep stages. And as you can see, it's not the case that every global state is uniquely associated with a particular global state of consciousness. But what is the case is that there are characteristic transition patterns between these global states for the different background states of consciousness. So the brain might be in the same global state, but depending on the state of consciousness the subject is in, the dynamics will be different. And this is captured by this nice model here. Okay, and the second challenge, why do states of an NCC correlate with states of consciousness? And here, as you can see in the definition provided by Chalmers, there's only the requirement that there be a mapping from states of N to states of consciousness. And this mapping can be completely arbitrary in the sense that it doesn't necessarily tell us anything about why these states are associated with consciousness. And Chalmers himself makes a suggestion how one can increase the explanatory and predictive power of NCCs. Namely, if one is not only able to map individual neural states to states of consciousness, as illustrated here, but if one is in addition also able to map relations between neural states to relations between states of consciousness. So for instance, it would be great if one had a measure of similarity between neural states that could also be mapped to similarity between conscious states. So in other words, it would be nice if there were a structure-preserving mapping between neural states and states of consciousness. And this, in fact, a similar idea is sketched or explored in this recent paper, in which a very similar idea is investigated using category theory. Okay, more generally, it would be desirable to have a structure-preserving mapping between neural states and states of consciousness, and also to have a link between features of neural activity and potential functions of consciousness, for example, cognitive capacities that are associated with consciousness, and a link between features of neural activity and theories of consciousness. And so what that would yield is then what Anil has called explanatory correlates of consciousness. Okay, the third challenge, what if conditions C are not fulfilled? So, I mean, ideally we would like to know what neural correlates of consciousness are in unusual cases, or perhaps even in non-human systems. So what are correlates of consciousness in non-human animals, and potentially also in machines. And so this is a recent study that investigated exactly this question. So there are different states that are associated with non-responsiveness. So it can be associated with a variety of brain lesions, varying levels of vigilance and covert cognition. And so even in cases in which persons are non-responsive, there can still be conscious experiences. And it would be great to have a measure of that, or find neural correlates of consciousness in such unusual cases. And the authors propose using a measure, basically a complexity measure, that can be applied to to global dynamics. And so this also speaks to the first challenge, that some NCCs are specified in terms of global dynamics and not in terms of states of single subsystems in the brain. Then, obviously, the potential cases of islands of awareness would also be candidates for unusual conditions. So an island of awareness is a conscious state that is neither shaped by sensory input nor able to be expressed by motor output. So it's a conscious experience within an isolated system. Potential examples discussed by Tim Bain, Emily Seth, and Marcello Massimini include excranial brains, hemispherotomy, and cerebral organoids. So an excranial brain is a brain that has been extracted from the cranium, but is kept alive. In hemispherotomy, large parts of the brain are basically, or the connections to other parts of the brain are cut. So a large part of the brain becomes isolated from the rest of the brain. And a cerebral organoid is a neural structure grown in the lab. And here the question is, can activity in these isolated systems give rise to consciousness? And we cannot just apply neural correlates of consciousness to these cases, because, well, the correlation with consciousness is only required to hold under usual conditions. And so we cannot just infer to unusual cases, because here they may not be, even if the same activity in these systems is observed, it may not be sufficient under these conditions for consciousness. And the authors suggest that measures of statistical or dynamical complexity, measures of dynamical complexity may be used to infer the presence of consciousness in such cases. Okay, here's another illustration of cases in which it can be difficult to infer the presence or absence of consciousness. This is from a paper by Tononi and Koch. Okay, so for the third challenge, it would be one thing that would be desirable is to be able to use quantitative measures, such as complexity measures, that can be applied to non-human systems or just to unusual cases. So this is a graphical summary of the three challenges that I discussed: global dynamics, explanatory correlates, and unusual cases. And for global dynamics, it would be desirable to characterize correlates of consciousness as features of processes, not just in terms of neural systems and states. For explanatory correlates, it would be desirable to map properties of consciousness or relations between conscious experiences to properties of neural activity. It would be desirable to have a link to functions of consciousness and to theories of consciousness, and then for unusual cases, quantitative measures. And in fact, I mean, there's exists a lot of work on these problems, and many of them rely on computational models of neural processes, of cognitive capacities, or features of consciousness. And in fact, so I'm not suggesting here that research on neural correlates of consciousness fails to meet these challenges or solve the problems associated with them. So I'm suggesting that the notion of an NCC, as proposed by Chalmers 20 years ago, fails to capture these tendencies, which actually show that the field moves away, at least to some extent, from purely neural correlates of consciousness and moves in the direction of computational correlates of consciousness. So I will now try to define what a computational correlate of consciousness is. So this is one of the important papers that proposed this notion of a computational correlate of consciousness. This is by Axel Klereman, and he defines computational correlates as principles of information processing with which to characterize the differences between conscious and unconscious processing. And he suggests that computational correlates include architectural specialization, properties of representation, and properties of specific processes. And there's a highly similar definition in a more recent paper by James Retcher and colleagues. So they take a computational correlate of consciousness to be any aspect of information processing that is associated with conscious cognitive activities, but not with unconscious cognitive processes. So again, it's related to the difference between conscious and unconscious processing. And in particular, they're interested in neurocomputational correlates of consciousness, the representation and processing of information in neural networks. So representation and information processing seem to be really central to computational correlates. And here I will provide a slightly more general definition of a computational correlate. So I will suggest that a computational correlate of consciousness should be regarded as an abstract, multi-realizable feature specified by a theoretical model of contents or vehicles that is necessary for consciousness. And there are at least two aspects of this definition that have to be clarified. So first, what do I mean by a theoretical model of contents or vehicles? And why should computational correlates be regarded as necessary for consciousness? Okay, so first try to illustrate what I mean by models of vehicles and models of content. So there are different types of models in theoretical neuroscience. A common distinction is between descriptive, mechanistic, and interpretive models. Another common distinction is between phenomenological, that is data fitting models, and explanatory models that also enable predictions or simulations. But these distinctions don't really capture what I'm after. So it's actually a bit embarrassing for me as a philosopher, because I mean, philosophers really like conceptual distinctions, and I'm almost sure that somewhere there the distinction that I have in mind has been made before, but I don't really know how to label this distinction. So I've chosen the labels models of vehicles and models of content. I'm not really satisfied with this. But perhaps you can we can talk about this in a discussion, and maybe some of you knows what the distinction is that I'm really after. So we'll just illustrate this with a few examples. So one example would be a distinction between a model that specifies probabilities of neuronal activity and then a model that specifies probabilities encoded by neuronal activity. This is a distinction that Mark Spivak discusses in a recent paper. And one example would be this study that I already cited, which actually this is a hidden Markov model of global neural states, which specifies transition probabilities between states. And we can contrast this with approaches such as predictive processing, or the free energy principle, active inference, or the Bayesian brain hypothesis, in which it is assumed that states of the brain encode probabilities of external states. Or another way, or maybe more crude way to make this distinction is, or to illustrate is, it's the difference between the blue brain project and the Bayesian brain hypothesis. Okay, now there's one more thing that I think I should highlight here. When I say models of vehicles, I don't mean that these models must ignore the contents of consciousness. So, and in principle, both models can be related to consciousness both, and there can be mappings between system states and dynamics and contents of consciousness, and mappings between encoded properties and contents of consciousness. And so to illustrate just two examples, so dynamical emergence theory by Roy Moyal and colleagues would qualify as a vehicle approach. So this is the central hypothesis of this theory. The contents of phenomenal consciousness are isomorphic to causally effective, coarse-grained macrostates defined over the system's dynamics. So this is a vehicle approach, but still there's a mapping to contents of consciousness. And we can contrast this with predictive processing accounts of consciousness. So here's on the left-hand side, a quotation from a classical paper by Jakob Hovey. What gets selected for conscious perception is a hypothesis or model that, given the widest context, is currently most closely guided by the current precise prediction errors. So there's reference to a hypothesis and contents, and this is even more explicit in a recent paper by Andy Clark, in which he says what we experience as qualia are simply content items in our best generative model of the world. Otherwise expressed, they are inferred latent variables posited by the brain to capture and predict useful patterns in the sensory stream. And now I hope this serves to highlight or to illustrate the distinction that I have in mind between models of content and models of vehicles. And now we can, of course, ask, well, should computational correlates be specified by vehicle or by content approaches? And we probably need both. So in principle, it should be possible to use either vehicle approach or content approach to specify computational correlates of consciousness. But a content approach or content approaches may be methodologically necessary. So it may be that we can only get this far with a purely vehicle approach. To illustrate, here's a statement from Christoph Koch in which he talks about the dirty secret of computational neuroscience, which is that we still do not have a complete dynamic model of the nervous system of the worm C. elegans, though it only has 302 nerve cells, and its wiring diagram, its connectome, is known. So here we are trying to understand the human brain when we do not yet understand the worm brain. And this idea has also been illustrated by two nice papers that were published a few years ago. So here's one paper called "A Neuroscientist Understand a Microprocessor," and the authors try to find out what you can find out, or try to determine what you can find out about how a microprocessor works using tools that neuroscientists, using methods and tools by neuroscience. And they found out, well, there's some limit to what can be understood. And they conclude ultimately the problem is not that neuroscientists could not understand a microprocessor. The problem is that they would not understand it given the approaches they're currently taking. And they suggest better theories could almost obviously have helped. If we'd known that the microprocessor had adders, we could have searched for them. So it can be useful to know what computations a system performs if you want to understand it. And there's a similar paper that was published even a few years earlier, The Tale of the Neuroscientists and the Computer, which is more like a thought experiment. So what would happen if a neuroscientist tried to understand a computer? And the conclusion is similar to the one reached in the other paper. And the author says, if we really care about the question of how the brain works, we must not delude ourselves into thinking that simply collecting more empirical results will automatically tell us how the brain works, any more than measuring the heat coming from computer parts will tell us how the computer works. And the author deplores that there's no one theoretical lingua franca against which to evaluate empirical results or to generate new predictions. So both papers suggest that more theory is needed, and So it's not just enough to gather data and fit models to them, but yeah, something like computational models would be, or models of content would be useful or perhaps necessary. Okay, so I hope this distinction between models of contents and vehicles becomes a bit clearer. Now, why should computational correlates of consciousness be regarded as necessary features or as specifying necessary conditions? And now, first of all, if we look at the definition provided by Axel Kleremans again, we see that on the one hand, he says, well, they characterize the difference between conscious and unconscious processing. So it seems that they must be sufficient for consciousness. On the other hand, he mentions properties of representations, such as their stability in time or their strength, and properties of specific processes, such as resonance, synchrony, interactivity, and so on. And it doesn't seem that these properties are really by themselves sufficient for consciousness. So it seems more that the individual CCCs are necessary for consciousness, and then perhaps they are jointly sufficient conditions. So that would, I guess, be a more accurate way of describing even what Axel Kleremans proposed here. And similarly, if we look at this other paper I cited, in this paper, the authors did exactly what the title says, modeling working memory to identify computational correlates of consciousness. And so they gave a model of working memory. And then the question was, what underlying computational mechanisms are critically needed to realize such a model? And so what this points to, again, are individually necessary conditions. What computational mechanisms are critically needed? And again, it may be that some of these individually necessary conditions are jointly sufficient, but that is not even implied by actual work on computational correlates of consciousness. So when I suggest that computational correlates of consciousness should be regarded as necessary conditions for consciousness, I'm basically just restating what is already being said in the literature on computational correlates of consciousness. And the only question is, will any number of individually necessary conditions for consciousness that are specified by or given in terms of computational correlates, will any of them be jointly sufficient for consciousness? And I will now suggest that should not be expected, and it's not really a problem. So there are three advantages if we regard CCCs as necessary conditions. And so one is that it can provide potential evidence for the absence of consciousness in unusual cases. And then the second point, it allows one to maintain a simulation a distinction between simulation and instantiation of consciousness. That actually also, if one believes that there is a difference between simulating a conscious system and actually instantiating consciousness in a system, then it's very unlikely that just implementing the right computational correlates will be sufficient for consciousness. It will be sufficient for simulation of consciousness, but not for consciousness as such. And then the third advantage, it has some potential for unification in the science of consciousness. So I think that the first point is really easy or can be easily grasped. So here's a paper by Sascha Fink, in which she critically discusses the notion of an NCC provided by David Chalmers. And he suggests in order to overcome some of the problems of the Chalmers NCC, it seems that we have to introduce necessity somewhere. Only then can we allow for interhypothetic competition. And this is the most important point here for our discussion. Only then can we apply our best NCC hypotheses to cases where we want to rule out that an organism currently is feeling something based on neural evidence. And I mean, a drastic example would be potential islands of awareness. if we have an NCC that involves a necessary condition for consciousness, then that may help to rule out cases of consciousness. Okay, so this is was the first advantage. The second distinction between simulation and instantiation of consciousness. So, I mean, if we suppose we have computational correlates of consciousness that are believed to be sufficient for consciousness in human beings, then we can implement them in machines. And the question then is, will this give rise to machine consciousness? So what if CCCs are instantiated in machines? And an assumption that I want to make here is that merely implementing the right computations will not suffice for consciousness. And if this assumption is true, then CCCs can at most be necessary. Now, of course, one can question this assumption or ask for a reason. And in a recent preprint with Carl Friston, we suggest that this can be motivated using the free energy principle as a background, as a theoretical background. But of course, if you don't believe in the free energy principle, then that doesn't really make this assumption more plausible, and you can still question it. So here I'll try to give at least some motivation for this hypothesis, namely, or this assumption. So if we start with the hypothesis that consciousness in a physical system enables flexible interaction with the physical environment of that system, and if we then look at computational correlates in such systems, and we can note that they can also be instantiated by virtual machines that do not interact with the physical environment of the physical machine on which they are running. And so one could argue that, well, if we just instantiate computational correlates of consciousness in virtual machines, then they will not have the same function they have for physical systems, and therefore they will not be sufficient for consciousness. But of course, you could ask, you could object, what if the virtual machine interacts with a virtual environment? So you could simulate a machine and simulate an environment. Wouldn't then the computational correlates enable flexible interaction with the simulated environment for this virtual machine? And a suggestion Carl Friston and me make in our preprint is that there are different causal flows involved between the system and its environment. So, and that this is a difference between a simulation and a really conscious system. So the basic idea is that in the normal case, or in the human case, there's a circular causal flow between internal states and external states that is mediated by sensory states and active states. So this is the main causal flow between the system, the internal states of the system and the environment. And if we simulate this in a computer with a von Neumann architecture, the flow will be different. So one characteristic feature of a von Neumann computer with a von Neumann architecture is that there's a distinct memory unit that can be distinguished from the CPU, the central processing unit. And so if we want to simulate internal and external states and sensory and active states, they will be represented in the memory unit. And then the main causal flow will not be between these simulated internal and external states, but it will always go through the central processing unit. And of course, there are CPUs that also include a memory unit. So you could also have the representation or the simulated internal and external states within the CPU. But then again, you would have a causal flow, not directly between these memory items, but there would always be a CPU, a control unit, and arithmetic or logic unit involved. We can compare this with what IIT says about computers and consciousness in machines. So this is from a paper by Tononi and Koch. In the general case, and certainly with machines, it becomes essential to consider the internal circuitry, not just what the machine does, but how it does it. And they illustrate this with these two systems. One is a system with recurrent connections, and one is a purely feed-forward system. And according to IIT, recurrent connections are necessary for consciousness, and there's no consciousness in the purely feed-forward system, although they have the same input-output mapping. So they are functionally isomorphic, but one is conscious, the other not, because of a difference in the internal causal structure of the system. And so according to IIT, what is important to distinguish a simulation between a really conscious system is that you need to specify, so what is important is not only what the system does, but also how it does it, the internal causal structure. And the proposal by Carl Friston and me that I just try to illustrate is that what matters is what, but also causal relations with the physical environment. So there's a slight difference between these suggestions. And again, to illustrate this, so a human being could be conscious because it has the right causal interaction with the environment. A von Neumann computer will not be conscious even if it simulates the same computational processes or performs the same computations as a human conscious brain. And now, of course, you could put a von Neumann computer inside an embodied robot. And if it then enables the right interaction with the environment because of the computations that are performed by this computer, then according to our proposal, it's at least not excluded that this embodied robot would be conscious. And this would be in stark contrast to the suggestion by Tononi and Koch that follows from IIT. But of course, you can question this, and I have a few more things to say about this, but we can talk about that in the discussion, I think. So then the third point, if we regard computational correlates of consciousness, or if we have computational correlates that are necessary for consciousness, this has some potential for unification in the science of consciousness. So here one might ask, well, why unification? Why do we even need that? And one reason is that there are some people who argue that actually there's a lot of disunity in the science of consciousness. And perhaps you agree, perhaps not. So this is from a paper by Elizabeth Irvine and Mark Spivak, in which they argue using different behavioral measures, unsurprisingly, leads to the identification of different neural correlates. So there are different behavioral measures of consciousness, and depending on which you use, you get different neural correlates. And without agreement about what counts as the right behavioral measure of consciousness, there can be no agreement about what the neural correlates and mechanisms of consciousness are. So this yields some disunity, and I'd like to add that this reasoning can be applied to computational correlates as well, because they're also based on measures of consciousness. You have to make some assumptions about consciousness, and if you disagree with respect to these assumptions, then you will get different computational correlates. Then I suggested that or mentioned that one approach to investigate computational correlates of consciousness is via computational models of cognitive capacities, and in particular of capacities that seem to require consciousness. Consciousness is necessary for these cognitive capacities, such as different types of learning, for instance, trace conditioning, rapid reversal learning, or cross-model learning. There have been are candidates for types of learning that cannot be performed without consciousness, in at least in humans. And if that generalizes, then these could serve as well, sufficient conditions for consciousness. But if and of course this could then be used to derive or to develop computational correlates of consciousness based on these different capacities. But if you have a list of cognitive capacities and make different models of them, you might end up with just a list of different computational correlates. And then one can ask, well, are these correlates of a single or of multiple different phenomena? And then another aspect of disunity, just to illustrate the same idea from a different angle. I mean, there's so many different theories of consciousness. This is just a small selection, and they make different assumptions about consciousness. And if we want to develop computational correlates of consciousness that are somehow based on different theories of consciousness, and we end up with different computational correlates. And yeah, somehow they have to be unified. And in a recent neuroscience of consciousness paper, I suggested that the science of consciousness does not need another theory. So we don't need more theories or combining theories, but instead we need a minimal unifying model of consciousness. What do I mean by that? So first of all, a minimal unifying model, or a MAM, specifies only necessary conditions for consciousness. It involves determinable descriptions that can be made more specific, and it unifies existing accounts of consciousness. To go into a bit more detail, empirically, MAM is minimal by specifying properties that most states of consciousness have in common. That is, it specifies only necessary features of most conscious experiences. Conceptually, it is minimal by offering a determinable characterization of these properties that can be refined in various ways, so it must not be too specific. And furthermore, MAM is unifying to the extent that it highlights assumptions that existing approaches have in common. And so the idea would be, if we have, for instance, different computational correlates derived from models of different cognitive capacities, one can ask, is there a common computational mechanism? And this would then yield a minimal unifying model. So that this could tell us what these have in common, or maybe there is no such thing. There's no mechanism that they have in common. And with respect to cognitive capacities, the idea would be that there's not just, so I mentioned these different learning capacities, and one hypothesis is that consciousness is associated with these learning capacities because it enables or facilitates all of them at once. So not just one, but that they form a cluster. And this is, of course, an empirical question, but it could also be empirical work on this could be complemented by theoretical work that tries to find a common computational mechanism that is necessary for different types of learning that are associated with consciousness. Okay. Now, if we try to put all this together, what contribution could computational correlates as necessary conditions for consciousness make to unification in the science of consciousness? Well, the idea would be that computational correlates can be associated with different theories of consciousness, with different cognitive abilities or markers of consciousness, with operationalized features of consciousness, such as dynamical complexity, and also with local and global states of consciousness. And then the idea would be, well, how can you, how could one develop necessary conditions derived from, or how could one develop computational correlates that identify some core computational mechanisms that are associated with all of these different aspects. So ideally, one would need a framework within which one could develop different models of different phenomena, and then because that could facilitate finding a common computational mechanism. And one example would be the free energy principle, together with a process theory such as active inference. So in a way that this, I regard the free energy principle as the ultimate minimal unifying model, because, well, it's unifying because it unifies different theoretical approaches. It's also minimal because it makes minimal assumptions, and I mean, it's also sometimes described as a tautology, so it's really minimally informative, as it were. But if you then specify or develop specific models, active inference models, that still adhere to the free energy principle, or in accordance with the free energy principle, you can get more specific, more informative models that are still connected by adhering to the free energy principle. This would be one possibility. Another possibility, perhaps category theory. I mean, I'm aware that some people here are thinking about this or working on this, and this would be a suggestion how computational correlates could contribute to unification in the science of consciousness. So let me conclude. I discussed 3 challenges for neural correlates of consciousness as standardly conceived, global dynamics, the question how to explain why neural states are associated with consciousness, or why activity in certain neural systems is associated with consciousness. Then how to find correlates under unusual conditions, and a solution is to move in the direction of computational correlates of consciousness. And I think that's just one trend that one can observe in current approaches. And I characterized computational correlates of consciousness as properties of theoretical models of consciousness, of content or vehicle models, and as necessary conditions for consciousness, which on the one hand captures how others have characterized CCCs, but also comes with some advantages because it enables the application to unusual cases. It allows one to maintain the distinction between simulation and instantiation of consciousness, and it also may have some potential for unification in the science of consciousness. Thank you for your attention.